Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about some best practices for diagrams in your quilt patterns. These are arguably the more important part of your quilt patterns, right? Not everybody will read the words, but everybody is going to look at the pictures. So having these right, and there's a couple of tweaks that we're going to talk about that makes them easier to follow, is really, really important because this is the thing that people are going to pay attention to most. So the first tip I have for you is to keep the outlines on. There are some folks out there, and I'd say it's like 50-50 right now, of people that won't have any outlines on in their diagrams at all. And other people will use outlines all the time. It's mostly a style thing, but it does kind of get to readability of your pattern as well, because those outlines are going to show your seam lines, and that's really important for someone trying to follow the pattern. In these two examples that I have here, you can see one, we've got the outlines, and on the other one, we don't. And we've actually got multiple pieces coming together for the background to where it's not just one solid piece, right? Like each of those is several distinct pieces, and having those outlines on makes it very, very clear to the reader where exactly the seams go, exactly how these pieces come together. And that's what they need to know when they're sewing a pattern. So if you choose to use a mock-up for the cover rather than a real quilt, I think definitely turn the outlines off, right? That keeps the magic of the quilt. That's what it's going to look like when it's all done, when you aren't really going to notice the seams anymore. But beyond that, once you get into the guts of the pattern and we're thinking about assembly and all of these things, it's really important to know where the seams go. So turn those outlines on and keep them on for all of your diagrams. This is also really helpful if you've got like a light colored background. That's really easy to blend in with the white of the paper. So if you don't have outlines around that thing, sometimes it looks like you're just missing pieces, and then it just doesn't make sense to your brain at all, because you're like, how does this even come together? We're missing a chunk of the block. It's not square anymore because we're missing that outline because it's just fading into the background of the page. Want to definitely avoid that. So outlines are the way to just kind of clear all of that out. Second tip I have for you is to show your layered objects offset. If you go through like any kind of sewing pattern that's like a garment sewing pattern from Simplicity or Butter or any of those kinds of traditional sewing pattern, garment pattern manufacturers, you will see this kind of offset as well. It's a pretty traditional convention for showing layered objects. IKEA uses it too if they've got layered things. You'll see it in cookbooks, like all over the place, right? They're going to show two things that are technically on top of each other. The top one will be slightly offset, so you can see there's something on the bottom underneath there, right? So in this particular example, I am showing you basically making like a 2 at a time half square triangle kind of shape. And on the left, we have it offset, so you can see that there's a piece under it, and we're actually layering 2 pieces of fabric. Versus on the right, I've also seen this in patterns where, you know, they're saying that's a layered piece of fabric as well, but the reader, can't actually tell there's a piece of fabric under there. So this could just as easily be used to show just a marking diagram, right? We're just taking one piece of fabric and marking a diagonal on it. Now, once you get, further steps down the pattern, you can take that layering away. But on the step where you're instructing them to layer something, I strongly, strongly recommend showing it offset. So it visually kind of cues your reader that there is actually an object under there and they have kind of that active layering. It's a little bit more intuitive for them. The next tip is to make sure that you show or call out those 1/4 inch seam allowances on details, right? Once we get past the detailed objects where we're pulling multiple shapes together, it is totally okay to kind of pull these away. But when we're first making the shape or on like a detailed view of it, you definitely want to show those 1/4 inch seam allowances. This is a question I get a lot from folks. Do I show the 1/4 inch seam allowances? Do I not? How important is that? It makes it a really big pain to draw the diagrams if you're showing them on every single piece. But because it is so immensely helpful for the reader, especially if that reader happens to be a beginning quilter or advanced beginner quilter where this is the first couple of quilts they've done. When you have pieces where you actually need to have that 1/4 inch above the point, it's not intuitive for a lot of people. And so if you don't show it in the diagram, people are going to try to make their piece match the diagram, and then they're screwed because they go to sew it to the next piece and they've completely lost that point. You don't know how many times I have seen in Facebook groups and on Reddit, help, my flying geese aren't points anymore when I sewed them together. They looked fine before I sewed everything together. What did I do wrong? What went wrong? Well, they didn't keep their 1/4 inch seam allowance across the point. And, some of that's just a newbie, right? Not understanding it. It's a little counterintuitive. It's just something that you don't really pick up until you do it in quilting. But if the pattern's not showing it, that's certainly not helping. You want to make sure that the diagrams more or less reflect exactly what they're going to see in their actual pieces as much as possible. And specifically on these kind of detailed things for the original shape, it really matters to have that 1/4 inch there so that it looks exactly like what they're seeing, and they make sure to keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, this is even more important when we're talking about curved pieces, where you've got to have like these little bits at the corners in order to make sure that you still have the edge of your circle. You don't blunt it when you sew these pieces together. So definitely call these things out on Drunkard's path blocks, any kind of curve block where that curve is kind of just blending into the edge of your block a little bit. A lot of people forget that there actually needs to be a 1/4 inch there. So you definitely want to call it out, a little arrow on it, a little circle saying, hey, this is a 1/4 inch here, calling those out, pointing to the specific markings and landmarks that they need to know when they're trimming or when they're making their block. That is really important on your diagrams. And again, do this on the detail, right? When we're first sewing or describing how to sew this Drunkard's path block together, for sure. But once you start taking multiple of these things together, it's less important. If you want to still show it there, it is still helpful. Anytime that you can show exactly what you're going to be seeing when you're sitting at your sewing machine is helpful, but it does make drawing the diagrams a lot harder. So when you start to aggregate a bunch of pieces together, this is less important. They also get really, really small and difficult to see. So less important once you've sewn a bunch of pieces together, but you definitely want to show this when you're making the initial piece. Alrighty, the final tip I have for you is to show your dimensions on the diagrams. A lot of people forget about this, but it is obnoxiously important. So at every step of your pattern, as you're bringing more and more pieces together, you want to include a dimension that you're expecting at that stage so that people can check their work, right? So as you sew more and more pieces together, if your seam allowances slip, things can shrink, things can grow. It's not good if you make a mistake and you don't realize it. These things just compound until you get to the point where you've got a seam rip like hundreds of seams sometimes. Like, it's just a nightmare. And quite honestly, for me, when that happens, I usually just retire the project and never finish it because it like irks me that much if I have to seam rip. So you want to give your reader as much a chance as possible to avoid that situation. And having these intermediate kind of check dimensions throughout the pattern is really helpful. Now you can do that by just writing it in the step, right? Make this unit, it should measure X by X dimension, and that's fine, but it does add a lot of verbiage. And again, a lot of people aren't reading the words completely, they're just kind of skimming them. So a better way to do it is to actually put those dimensions on the diagram themselves. It also allows you to show exactly what you're measuring. So if you've got like a diamond here, a lot of times those are measured kind of like flat to flat rather than point to point. So you can show exactly what dimension is supposed to be this number rather than having people misinterpret it, if that makes sense. This also cuts down on your word count, allows you to kind of compress the pattern. So if you're doing print patterns and you're trying to get everything into a smaller number of pages to keep costs down, this is a really helpful way to do that because you just put it on the diagrams. You don't even have to talk about it in the text. And there's a bunch of ways to do this. You can just put like a little line there. You can put the little T end caps like you would see on like an engineering diagram or something like that. I like to do arrows and then just write in the dimension there. But putting it on the diagrams, I know I'm always going to put it there, so I never have to address it in the text. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you today. Hope you found this video helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for Tech Tip Tuesday.